some people may still be joining us. First of all, I'd like to welcome you all and thank you for coming. My name is Brian Garvey, and I'm the organizer at Massachusetts Peace Action. We're one of the group that's helping to organize and co-sponsor a series of webinars on economic sanctions and their effect on nations battling the coronavirus. Last week, we did the first in our series on the effects of sanctions on Iran. And this week, it's very timely, we're going to be addressing the effects of sanctions and the increasing tensions between the United States and Venezuela. Next Thursday, we will be addressing sanctions on Cuba and also their efforts to fight coronavirus, both in Cuba and abroad. They've really done some wonderful things developing drugs and sending doctors around the world as well. And the following Thursday, that will be April the 16th at 8 p.m., we will be addressing U.S. sanctions on North Korea, and their effect on the people of that country. And we'll also be talking about South Korea's response to the coronavirus and how they were able to flatten the curve and keep their numbers down. So we thank you for joining us this evening for our second in a series of 4 webinars on sanctions and on coronavirus and the response. Cole, if you wouldn't mind, I'm just going to mute you so people can't hear your typing efforts. Cole will be providing tech support and fielding your questions for Kevin. A little bit about Massachusetts Peace Action. We are the largest grassroots peace organization in the Commonwealth, and we're also part of a national network, Peace Action, that has affiliates all across the country. So we work to fight militarism. We work for nuclear disarmament. We work to end U.S. wars, occupations, and economic sanctions, which are really just another form of warfare. And we also work to cut our absurd military budget so we can take those important resources and use them to fund human needs like healthcare, infrastructure. Can put that money towards saving the environment. We try and connect all of these issues to war and peace. We're putting on this webinar series with the help of a new coalition that has sprung up to respond to this crisis. We're calling it Lift the Sanctions Massachusetts. Mass Peace Action, of course, the Massachusetts Bolivia Solidarity Committee of Western Mass, the Resistance Center for Peace and Justice, the Latin America Solidarity Coalition of Western Mass, Boston Democratic Socialists of America, the American Friends Service Committee, CISPIS, the Committee in Solidarity with the People of El Salvador, the Campaign for Peace, Disarmament, and Common Security, NIAC, the National Iranian American Council, the Peace and Social Justice Committee of Friends Meeting at Cambridge, and Code Pink, Women for Peace. And this is also a growing coalition. I see Venselcom has joined us as well, the Venezuelan Solidarity Committee, of course, very fitting for tonight. And organizations that are interested in joining us, please reach out to myself, Brian at masspeaceaction.org, or Cole at masspeaceaction.org. We would love you to join the effort. So tonight, our expert who is presenting for us is Professor Kevin Young from UMass Amherst. He is a professor of history and he focuses on modern Latin America. His research analyzes social movements, coalitional politics, and political power across Latin America. Tonight he's going to be featuring video testimony from people in Venezuela on the ground talking about the effects of these sanctions and what it's doing to the Venezuelan health system and just how it's affecting daily life for the people of Venezuela. And we're also going to be providing you with the opportunity to take action, because we really need to put all the pressure that we can on our political system, on the Trump administration, and on our members of Congress to denounce these sanctions and demand that they end immediately, given the crisis that's going on in Venezuela right now. So there is some legislation that we would love you to support and to encourage your member of Congress to support. Ilhan Omar's bill, the Congressional Oversight of Sanctions Act, and also David Cicilline's bill, David Cicilline from Rhode Island, HR 1004, which would limit President Trump's ability to make war on Venezuela. And that's especially important because we see right now, last week, the Trump administration put out, well, let's call it what it is. It was a $15 million bounty on the president of Venezuela. And just yesterday, and right now, the Trump administration is sending warships to Venezuela. And really, it's completely immoral to be escalating tensions when we should be all standing together to fight this global menace that is the coronavirus. Instead, the Trump administration is using this crisis as a chance to put more pressure on Venezuela and other countries across the world. So we really need all of us to come together now and demand action. So we thank you all for joining us tonight. And without further ado, I would like to pass it over to Professor Kevin Young, who can give us more information about what's going on in Venezuela and what we can do about it. Thank you, Kevin.
Right. Thank you, Brian and Cole. And I'm going to attempt to share my screen with you all. Okay. Hopefully you can see that. So first off, thanks to Cole and Brian and Mass Peace Action and everyone who helped put together this webinar. It's really good to be with you all, albeit virtually, during this stressful time. I'm going to make 3 points, a 3-point summary for you. First of all, US sanctions deliberately inflict suffering on the Venezuelan people in an effort to overthrow their government. And as such, the sanctions are a form of terrorism, both under international law and by the United States' own laws, in fact. And the sanctions are especially criminal and especially immoral in this context of the COVID-19 pandemic, the worst global public health crisis in a century. Secondly, the United States, in the face of this pandemic, has overtly tried to exploit the crisis. They've barely even hid the fact that they're trying to do that. The United States, over the last several years, has repeatedly escalated its attack on Venezuela. And the timing of each escalation is very significant. The timing of each escalation in US hostilities suggests that the goal of US policy has been to prevent or derail a peaceful political settlement when the prospect of a peaceful settlement appears on the horizon. So the way that the United States is trying to take advantage of the pandemic is really just the latest example in what is a longer-term pattern in US policy of trying to exploit political and economic and public health crises in Venezuela. But I would argue that the current moment is especially dangerous. And I think that the impacts of US policy are more dangerous and more lethal in Venezuela than they have ever been before. Thirdly, on a more optimistic note, there are things that we can do. And especially for those of us in the United States, our actions do matter. We do have some concrete things that we can do to try to change what the United States government is doing. So I'm not going to go too deeply into the historical background here for sake of time. But I want to mention a few highlights. 1998, Hugo Chavez, a progressive president, is elected for the first time, and he would serve as president until his death in March of 2013. Chavez presided over a social democratic turn in Venezuelan policy. So his government, first off, gained control over the state-owned oil industry. He asserted executive branch control over the oil industry, which allowed the government to then channel oil revenues into social programs like education, public health care, low-cost public housing, nutrition programs, land redistribution programs, robust progressive measures. He also presided over some very interesting experiments in participatory democracy. The promotion of institutions known as communal councils and communes, which are very interesting initiatives in grassroots political democracy that involve people taking control essentially over their own lives. Now, those experiments are still around today. Now, Hugo Chavez, of course, had his flaws. He wasn't a saint, but the reason why he inspired so much rage and so much opposition wasn't because of those flaws. He inspired that opposition more due to his virtues, due to the things that he was doing right, than to his vices. So the fact that he was challenging US power in Venezuela, the fact that he was challenging the power of capitalists, those were the things that inspired the right-wing opposition against him, from the United States, from domestic Venezuelan capitalists, from foreign investors, from a good portion of the Venezuelan middle class. All of these sectors coalesced in opposition to his government and never really accepted the legitimacy of his government, despite the fact that he won election after election. Now, when he dies of cancer in 2013, his successor, who was elected in April of that year, Nicolas Maduro, elected for the first time after Chavez's death. It's at that point when Maduro wins that election by a narrow margin. And the United States and its right-wing allies really smell blood at that point. They realize that Maduro is more vulnerable than Chavez had been. Having come into power on this narrow margin of victory. So it's at that point that US and right-wing hostility really escalates against the Maduro government. We see violent right-wing protests in 2014, and the following year, President Obama declares Venezuela, quote, an unusual and extraordinary threat to US national security. Now, that declaration is preposterous, but it's not unprecedented. And I'll give you one precedent. If you go back to the Cuban Revolution of 1959, after the Cuban Revolution, the United States went all around the Americas trying to rally governments to denounce Cuba and expel Cuba from all of the hemispheric governance bodies like the OAS. And it had some trouble, though, with getting Mexico on board. The Mexican ambassador in Washington responded, and this is a quote, "If we publicly declare that Cuba is a threat to our security, 40 million Mexicans will die laughing." So the quote from Obama is reminiscent of that earlier episode in which the United States claimed that this tiny nation of Cuba in the Caribbean was an existential threat to the United States. Now, in 2015, President Obama initiates sanctions on a number of officials within the Maduro administration. And the declaration, this absurd declaration that he made, was actually necessary in order to impose those sanctions, because sanctions are only permissible under US law if a president claims that a country is a dire threat to US national security. So that's 2015, the sanctions against Maduro administration officials, and this represents a significant escalation of US hostility. If we go forward to 2017, there's another round of violent right-wing protests in the streets. And in August of that year, President Trump initiates financial sanctions against Venezuela, which are much more severe and much broader than the sanctions that Obama had initiated. These sanctions in August of 2017 cut off Venezuela from the US credit market, meaning that Venezuela is no longer able to get loans from US lenders, and it's unable to restructure its foreign debt. And this has a devastating impact on the oil industry, oil comprising the vast majority of Venezuelans' exports, as I'll talk about in a second. 2018, Maduro wins re-election. For the sake of time, I'm not going to delve into the complexities of that re-election. It's boycotted by most of the right-wing opposition, although not all of it. And Maduro wins in May of 2018. The next year, January of last year, the United States senses vulnerability. It senses that the Maduro regime is vulnerable, and therefore it comes out in support of a very little known right-wing politician named Juan Guaido, the president of the National Assembly, to that point unknown to most Venezuelans. So the United States support Guaido when he stands up and declares himself the interim president of Venezuela. At the same time, the United States imposes its most drastic sanctions yet against the Venezuelan state-owned oil company. This is January of last year, which prevents Venezuela from selling oil to the United States. In August of last year, the US again escalates those sanctions still further by threatening to go after third parties. That is, foreign companies that do business with the United States would be subject to blacklisting and fines and other kinds of retaliation from the US government. And it has made good on some of those threats. Fast forward to just a week or so ago, March, the United States indicts Maduro for, in its words, narco-terrorism. So over the last 3 weeks, just since March 12th, the United States has significantly escalated its hostility against Venezuela in a number of ways, which I'm going to talk about a bit later. So how do the sanctions affect Venezuela? And they affect Venezuela in a few basic ways. First of all, they prevent imports by the Venezuelan public sector. For instance, they cut off access to foreign banks, which are necessary for carrying out the transactions that are necessary to import goods. They prohibit foreign businesses from doing business with Venezuela. Secondly, they prevent exports by the public sector. So in Venezuela, that means oil. Oil is comprises virtually the entirety of Venezuelan exports by value. So by preventing Venezuela from exporting its oil, the sanctions prevent Venezuela from getting access to the foreign exchange, that is dollars, that's necessary to import essential goods. So this is stemming from last year, the January 2019 announcement of this new drastic round of sanctions. And this is extremely severe because in 2018, the year prior, the United States had actually bought 36% of Venezuela's oil. So up until last year, Venezuela really depended on the US economy as a trade partner. So right there, it lost 36% of its trading partners directly. The United States also pressured other countries all around the world to stop trading with Venezuela. As a consequence, during the year 2019, Venezuelan oil production dropped 32%, precipitous decline in Venezuela's oil production. As a result, Venezuela has had to struggle just to find trading partners. It's to some extent been able to continue trading with China, Russia, India, but it's faced an uphill battle just to find customers that will take its oil. And one of the results of that is that Venezuela has had to sell its oil at far below production costs. There's a recent estimate that Venezuela has been selling some of its oil at $3 a barrel, which suggests the dire straits that it finds itself in. Early 2020, just the last month or two, there have been other factors that have compounded this crisis still further. So the oil price war between Saudi Arabia and Russia has had a huge impact on the Venezuelan oil economy by driving down the global price of oil. And then added to that is the pandemic, which is causing a drop in global oil demand, which hurts the Venezuelan economy still further. So for all of these reasons, the present moment right now, just in the last few weeks, is especially dire for Venezuela. Now, you might say that is it really true that the sanctions alone are to blame for Venezuela's economic woes? And the answer to that is no. Venezuela has complex economic problems which are not reducible to the impacts of the sanctions. Yet the sanctions have played an extremely important role in crippling the economy, crippling oil production, and preventing the government from taking some of the necessary economic measures that could put the economy on the right track. So we get a sense of this if we compare Colombian oil production with Venezuelan oil production. Colombia here is the red line, Venezuela is the blue. This is between 2013 and the middle of last year. And you notice that when the global oil price dropped, the production of oil in both Colombia and Venezuela dropped, basically in tandem. And then as Colombian oil production was essentially stabilizing at around 820,000 barrels a day, that's the moment at which Trump imposes financial sanctions in August of 2017. There is a dramatic decline in Venezuelan oil production after that point, and there's an even steeper decline starting in January of last year. So the sanctions, when you look at it this way, have had a drastic impact on the Venezuelan economy, even if they're not the only cause of Venezuela's problems. A third way that the sanctions affect Venezuela is through a credit blockade. And I mentioned this before. The inability of the Venezuelan government and the state-owned oil company to access foreign loans and also to restructure the existing foreign debt that it had. That has far-reaching implications for the economy. The inability to invest in new production in the oil sector or in other sectors for that matter. The inability to take out loans to invest in new capital, replacement parts for machinery, and so on and so forth. Far-reaching implications there. And a fourth way that sanctions affect Venezuela is through what business analysts call overcompliance. Companies are hesitant to trade with Venezuela, not necessarily because of legal prohibitions, but also because the legal prohibitions themselves are often ambiguous. They don't want to take a chance. So they err on the side of over-complying with the sanctions. Now, take all these factors together, and the consequence is that the sanctions have cost Venezuela $17 billion a year since 2017. Now, two things to say about this estimate. This estimate actually comes from the work of an economist, of an opposition economist in Venezuela, a guy named Francisco Rodriguez, who has never been sympathetic to Chavez or to Maduro. So the fact that he's issuing this estimate is especially significant, $17 billion a year. And the second thing I want to say about this estimate is that $17 billion amounts to 4 times the non-oil imports of Venezuela each year. So what does that mean? If Venezuela wasn't hit by these sanctions, it would have enough resources to import 4 times as much stuff as it currently is. So any way you slice it, the sanctions have had devastating and criminal impacts on the Venezuelan people. Now, this also means that this exception that policymakers are always talking about for imports of food and medicine, we often hear that sanctions regimes include exemptions on food and medicine so that starving people can get food and patients can get medicine. That's a very disingenuous lie. Because if a country is prohibited from exporting its main commodity, oil, it doesn't have the revenue to be able to import those things. So even if there is technically an exception in the sanctions regime, if they don't have the money, if they're prevented from getting the money to be able to import those things, then that exception is really a fiction. Now, all of this has far-reaching implications for daily life. I've been talking about statistics and figures and so on, but it's important to keep in mind the impacts on Venezuelans' daily lives in terms of access to food, access to medicines. All of these things, all of these essential things are scarce or they're prohibitively expensive for the Venezuelan people. It also means that other essential goods and services that the economy relies on are in short supply or very expensive. So the electricity sector, for instance, the electricity sector is unable to import a lot of the things that it needs to maintain the electrical grid. And there have been many blackouts over the last year or so in Venezuela as a result of this. And in terms of the human consequences, there was a study that came out a year ago, April of 2018, which I would really recommend to everyone, from the Center for Economic and Policy Research. It was co-authored by Mark Weisbrot and Jeffrey Sachs, two economists, and they calculated that the sanctions have cost Venezuela 40,000 human lives. And that's only in 1 year. That's from 2017 to 2018. That's the difference in the Venezuelan mortality rate that they calculated just for that 1 year. And it's surely gotten worse since. So all of these economic consequences in turn lead to vast levels of human suffering. And this is why most Venezuelans oppose the sanctions. Most Venezuelans are strongly opposed to the sanctions because they realize the impacts that they're having. So at the same time that you see people like Juan Guaido and other far-right opposition leaders vocally supporting and defending the sanctions, most of the opposition, or most of the population rather, even the people who don't necessarily like the Maduro government, are mostly opposed to the sanctions because they understand the impact. So I'm going to show a clip from a commune organizer from rural Venezuela. Her name is Amarellis Guzman, and she's an organizer of an agricultural commune to the west of the capital, Caracas, in the state of Yaracuy. This was recorded a few days ago.
Desde la Comuna Socialista Máximo Vizcaya, para aportar sobre la situación que hoy día venimos padeciendo, como son las sanciones económicas implementadas por el gobierno de Trump, que no traen más que consecuencia a la población venezolana, como son la escasez de alimentos, la escasez de medicina y la escasez de insumos agrícolas, tanto para animales como la producción agrícola. Por tanto, rechazamos categóricamente todas estas sanciones que no son más que problemáticas e influyen en la población venezolana. La Virgen de la parroquia Campo Elías del municipio Bruzual no escapa de esta situación. Por lo tanto, desde la comuna, la vocera Amarellis Guzmán de Planificación rechaza categóricamente todas estas sanciones y le hacemos un llamado a este gobierno que no quiere nada con el pueblo, que cese ya la injerencia contra los pueblos venezolanos. No vamos a desmayar, seguimos en batalla constante contra todas adversidades. Viva Chávez, viva Maduro, viva la comuna. Comuna o nada.
Okay, so now I want to talk a little bit about the Venezuelan healthcare system and the way that healthcare is impacted by the sanctions. And this brings us more up until the present. I want to I want to allow the father that you see here on the bottom right, Jorge Tarazona, to talk a little bit about his experience with the healthcare system. Jorge, who you see there, and his wife Adrienne and their daughter Desiree have had an especially excruciating crisis on their hands over the last several years. Their daughter Desiree is 3 years old, and she has a disease of the lymph nodes, chronic lymphadenitis. Don't ask me to explain what it is, but she hasn't been able to get the treatment that she needs in Venezuela. So Jorge is going to share a little bit about his experience with the Venezuelan healthcare system and the sanctions. And this is an interview that I did in June of last year. And the clip comes from the documentary that I collaborated on called The Venezuelans Under Siege.
Venezuela está muy mal en el sistema de salud y no lo voy a achacar solamente a problemas internos, me parece que es más bien a problemas externos. Cuando me refiero a problemas externos es que nosotros sabemos del bloqueo que nos tienen, que es muy fuerte. Yo puedo hablarte con documentos en mano. O sea, mi hija nació en el... y son perfectamente verificables por ti. Mi hija nació en una clínica del Estado. El Estado tiene clínicas en Caracas donde costea, sea cesárea, parto normal, simplemente tú cumples con tu seguro social, tú cancelas tu seguro social, tú estás al día así, tú tienes derecho, tú octavas a un cupo en la clínica para poder aceptarlo. Esto fue en el 2016 y aquí están los documentos para verificarlo. Al 2018, cuando a Desiree se le presenta la enfermedad que se le presenta, que volvemos a utilizar el sistema de salud nacional, o sea, el cambio fue enorme. En dos años se vino abajo. Como repito, fuera de los factores internos, sé y me consta que han sido más por factores externos. Yo estoy convencido del bloqueo que está vulgarmente matándonos a nuestros hijos y a nuestros ancianos.
Last year, that was before the pandemic, obviously, and it gives you a sense of how ill-prepared the Venezuelan healthcare system is, due in large part to the sanctions. And when I say it's ill-prepared, it's not just the lack of medicines, it's also the lack of the most basic things in Venezuelan hospitals, the lack of water. Water, the pumping of water is reliant on the supply of electricity. So the problems with the electrical grid in Venezuela have all of these far-reaching effects on access to water, including in the hospitals. Doctors complain about the lack of consistent running water, the lack of soap, the lack of sanitizers. So when we think about the shortages in the United States at the current time, you can multiply that probably by a factor of 10 and imagine what the situation is like in Venezuela. Now, how has the Venezuelan government been responding to the current pandemic? The Venezuelan government has taken a very aggressive response to safeguard the country against the coronavirus. On March 12th, this was sort of day zero in Venezuela. Nicolás Maduro announced the first emergency measures. He prohibited large public gatherings, and it wasn't until the day after, on March 13th, that the first 2 confirmed cases of coronavirus in Venezuela were discovered. So if we think of that as day 1, March 13th, within 4 days, the government had declared a national shelter-in-place order, or what they call quarantine there, but the equivalent of our national shelter-in-place. So this is something that many U.S. states still haven't done, even given the point at which we're at in this crisis. The government also set up a national online portal with a survey that people could take to describe any symptoms that they were having. And within a week or so, an estimated 12 million Venezuelans had taken the online survey. So these are very aggressive measures to try to track the spread of the virus and to contain it and control it. The government has also responded with economic measures to try to keep people afloat. So it's prohibited businesses from laying off workers for 6 months. It has suspended rent payments and debt payments for 6 months. It has declared a moratorium on telephone and internet service shutoffs. And it's also promised to cover or to help cover the costs of small and medium-sized businesses so that they can survive. Now, it's still an open question where that money is going to come from for them to help prop up the economy like that. And there are real doubts about how exactly that's going to happen. But the main point here is that in terms of the public health response and the economic response, the government has taken a very aggressive approach, which contrasts pretty starkly with the response of the Trump administration in the United States. So this guy is representative of the vice president's office in Venezuela. His name's Oliver Rivas.
Debemos decir que desde el primer momento que se reportaron casos en países fronterizos como Brasil y Colombia, aun cuando todavía no había el primer caso positivo en Venezuela, el presidente informó sobre la inminente presencia del virus en el territorio y llamó a una serie de medidas de contención: la inhibición del saludo y el contacto físico, las medidas de higiene respectivas, información sobre el virus, sobre su prevención, entre otras. Pero tan pronto se reportan los 2 primeros casos positivos en el país, nuestro gobierno toma la decisión de decretar una cuarentena social y colectiva, primero por segmentos, sectores productivos y regiones, y luego extendida en la totalidad del territorio nacional, una extensión casi completa de circulación en el territorio, incluso más que por coerción del Estado, por conciencia colectiva de la importancia de acatar esta medida, y por supuesto también una actuación territorial de todo lo que llamamos nosotros poder popular y del sistema de salud, sobre todo el primer nivel de atención integral, general y preventiva a través de Barrio Adentro, de los médicos cubanos y venezolanos que están actuando desde cada comunidad del país. Y eso permite una actuación sumamente efectiva, de la mano, por supuesto, del gobierno cubano y chino, a quienes le agradecemos, que han prestado una colaboración solidaria, sin condicionamientos, sin chantaje ni amenazas a nuestro pueblo, y permite que hoy podamos decir también que, si bien tenemos una situación de riesgo para todo el mundo, bueno, hemos logrado, como bien ha explicado nuestra vicepresidenta y el vicepresidente sectorial para el área comunicacional y el presidente Maduro, mantener una curva, digamos, de crecimiento aritmético y no geométrico, no exponencial, y poder decir que, si bien lamentablemente hay 3 personas fallecidas, los casos de recuperación superan en más de 13 veces los casos de las personas fallecidas.
So now we're going to hear from a doctor who is the director of an independent health observatory in Venezuela. In this video, he also recorded for us just a few days ago.
Saludos, es el doctor Ricardo León, médico internista, investigador, director del Observatorio Venezolano Salud, Medio Ambiente e Impacto Social de Venezuela. Desde Venezuela estamos enfrentando el coronavirus con las medidas de distanciamiento social mucho antes de decretado el primer caso importado que tuvimos en Venezuela. Actualmente la media de propagación en Venezuela está muy por debajo de todos los países en Latinoamérica, incluso muchos de los países en el mundo. Nosotros solo tenemos 2 fallecidos, tenemos 39 casos recuperados, de 100% recuperados de coronavirus. Las medidas de cuarentena han sido acatadas con conciencia por el pueblo. Lamentablemente las medidas coercitivas, las sanciones contra nuestro país nos hacen tomar medidas de distanciamiento social y nos hacen incluso buscar alternativas en países que nos ayuden con los medicamentos. A pesar de que tenemos el protocolo que indica la OMS para atender a nuestro pueblo, si se incrementaran los casos en Venezuela, nos pondrían al sistema de salud, que es un sistema de salud blindado, con atención primaria de salud bien fuerte, nos pondrían, por supuesto, en una situación grave. Lamentablemente, el incremento de los casos en Estados Unidos nos pone en alerta por el constante intercambio comercial, militar y de otros tipos que tienen con Colombia y con Brasil, que son países cercanos. ¿Qué necesitamos? Bueno, que cesen las sanciones para nosotros poder obtener de manera rápida la ayuda con respecto a medicamentos, a insumos médicos que necesita Venezuela. Afortunadamente nosotros no hemos sido tan golpeados por las medidas de conciencia que está teniendo nuestro pueblo, las medidas del Estado de resguardo de la población y distanciamiento social. Nosotros estamos convencidos de que si libran las sanciones podríamos incluso ayudar a otros países y ser solidarios como siempre lo hemos sido. Venezuela tiene una tradición desde hace 20 años de tener una poderosa línea de atención primaria, un escudo epidemiológico que le permita a la población estar resguardada y, por supuesto, empoderada de los conceptos de higiene y de atención primaria. Un saludo desde Venezuela para todo el mundo, de verdad. Necesitamos estar unidos y quedarnos en casa para combatir el COVID-19.
So just to elaborate briefly on some of what he was saying, and to describe a little bit about how the sanctions undermine the pandemic response. Some of this is already implicit. You could probably already guess this from what I presented before, but you know, obviously Venezuela lacks the money to be able to import the medicines and the equipment. You know, most of the essential gear that we're talking about in this country, personal protective equipment, ventilators, and so on, those kinds of things need to be imported. They rely on imported inputs and so on. In Venezuela, it doesn't have the money to be able to import that. Financial transactions are blocked. The crisis in the electricity sector is far-reaching with many ripple effects elsewhere in the economy. The government lacks the money to bail out workers and businesses. So what I alluded to before, that's going to be a very vexing question in the weeks and months ahead. You know, at the level of the body, nutritional deficiency contributes to immune suppression and makes the population much more vulnerable to the virus. So really, the COVID-19 pandemic could not be coming at a worse time for Venezuela. And from another point of view, though, from the U.S. point of view, that's really the point. It always has been the point. The point is to inflict enough suffering so that the Venezuelan people will rise up against their government. And if we go back to the Cuban Revolution example again, this is 1960, State Department official articulating toward Cuba. And he recognized that Castro was actually a very popular leader in Cuba. And he said that therefore every possible means should be undertaken to weaken the economic life of Cuba, to make the greatest inroads in denying money and supplies to Cuba, to decrease monetary and real wages, and to bring about hunger, desperation, and overthrow of the government. So that's Cuba. If we fast forward now to Venezuela in 2018, much the same policy is being articulated at the highest levels. I won't read the whole thing, but it's essentially the same policy. Make the Venezuelan people feel pain, induce a total economic collapse, and that's our policy, and we're going to stick to it. We're going to keep it on the Venezuelans. So that's 2 years ago. You can find this quote online if you search for it. So that's where the title of my presentation came from. And then this last quote that I'm going to show is from Secretary of State Pompeo, and this is just a quick clip.
Are you satisfied with the pace of the momentum behind Guaido?
We always wish things could go faster, but I'm very confident that the tide is moving in the direction of the Venezuelan people, and will continue to do so. It doesn't take much for you to see what's really going on there. the circle is tightening. The humanitarian crisis is increasing by the hour. I talked with our senior person on the ground there in Venezuela last night at 7 o'clock or 8 o'clock last night. You can see the increasing pain and suffering that the Venezuelan people are suffering from.
All right, so that's Pompeo, Secretary of State, as you can see, kind of relishing the economic pain of the Venezuelan people and speaking with the smugness of someone who knows he'll never be punished for his crimes. So just briefly, what has the United States been doing in the last 3 weeks? A statement from the Department of State just in the last few days, our pressure will continue and it will build steadily. So there you have it. The United States is promising to not only continue, but amplify the pressure on Venezuela in the form of sanctions, enabling it to leverage the pandemic for its own political agenda. So how is it doing that? Well, the International Monetary Fund, which is largely controlled by the United States, rejected a Venezuelan request for $5 billion in emergency aid to deal with the pandemic. Soon after that, the United States indicts Maduro and 14 other top officials for what they call narco-terrorism, puts a $15 million bounty on Maduro's head. This it did with the flimsiest of evidence. And if you're in the United States government, you don't need to offer any evidence. But even assuming that the United States had the evidence, you still have to marvel at the level of hypocrisy here in going after Maduro. At the same time, the United States is closely allied with regimes that are far more involved in narco trafficking and in right-wing paramilitary networks in Latin America. So Colombia, Honduras, Guatemala, a number of other examples. And if you look at the United States' own data, if you look at the amount of cocaine that is trafficked into the United States in 2018, 6 times as much went through Guatemala as went through Venezuela. And this is the specific charge that the United States is directing against Maduro, is that he is, in the words of the Department of Justice, intending to flood the United States with cocaine in order to undermine the health and well-being of our nation. That's the actual quote from the Department of Justice. Now, Venezuelans might be inclined to turn that quote around and point out the ways that the United States is undermining the health and well-being of their nation, and in a very deliberate way. So to understand this indictment on narco-terrorism charges, I think it's important to go back to the point I made at the beginning. The real motive behind this was to sabotage the chance for a peaceful political settlement. If we look at each of the United States' escalations of hostilities over the last several years, they've all come at moments when the possibility of political compromise and settlement in Venezuela is on the horizon. We looked at early 2018, the negotiations that the United States then derailed. August 2019, when it escalated the sanctions last year. And then March of 2020, the day before the United States announced the indictment, Maduro and a number of opposition figures had signaled a mutual willingness to work together to confront the coronavirus pandemic. Enrique Capriles, who's a right-wing political leader, former presidential candidate, proposed cooperation with the regime to fight the pandemic. Maduro accepted that offer, and he called in the Vatican to be a mediator. The very next day is when the United States releases that indictment. So the timing is very telling. And then just the other day, just yesterday, Trump sent doubled the number of U.S. naval forces in the Caribbean in a clear threat to Venezuela. The United States also senses particular vulnerability for all the reasons that I've mentioned before. And there's some indication that US sanctions and threats against other countries are having an impact. On the 28th, the Russian oil firm, huge Russian oil firm Rosneft, which is a big investor in Venezuela, a big trade partner, announced its withdrawal from 5 Venezuelan oil projects, which is a huge deal. Rosneft had soon before this had been subject to US secondary sanctions, threats of blacklisting and retaliation and so on. And essentially, it appears like it caved to the pressure in announcing its withdrawal from Venezuela. And then just the other day, on the 31st, the United States announced this so-called democratic framework for Venezuela, which would involve Maduro needing to step down, and the National Assembly, which is controlled by the opposition, would be able to designate a 5-person council, which would act as the interim governing body in the country until new presidential elections were held. And the United States says, we're going to maintain the major sanctions against Venezuela until Maduro is deposed as the leader. So that was just the other day. And, this is a quote from Donald Trump just yesterday. As governments and nations focus on the coronavirus, there is a growing threat that cartels, criminals, terrorists, and other malign actors will try to exploit the situation for their own gain. And, as is so often the case with Donald Trump, the thing that he accuses his enemies of doing is precisely what he himself is doing. So in a way, I actually agree with him here. There are criminals, terrorists, and other malign actors who are trying to exploit the situation for their own gain. So in closing, what can we do? Brian mentioned some of these things at the outset. There are some important congressional bills that we need to be pressuring our representatives to support. The Cicilline Bill 1004 is legislation from last year to prohibit military action in Venezuela, which is still not out of the realm of possibility, as Trump has signaled in recent days. We also need to be looking beyond the military action to condemn the sanctions themselves and to end the sanctions, which have been so lethal in Venezuela. Ilhan Omar has a bill, the Congressional Oversight of Sanctions Act, which would give Congress strong oversight over sanctions against foreign countries. And we also need to demand that our legislators publicly denounce sanctions. Not just sign on to a bill, but take a stand in really educating the public about the impacts of these sanctions and condemn those. Obviously, we have to continue our educational work. The impacts of sanctions on foreign populations is not something that's on most people's radar. The United States is not directly intervening militarily, so the effects of the sanctions are much more hidden from view for most of the U.S. public, which means we have a lot of educational work to do. And the third thing I'd mention is the need for direct solidarity with Venezuelans. That is the form of direct monetary aid of medicines and food and things like that. One effort that I've been involved with, and this is just one of several possibilities, is a fund that we've set up to aid community-run pharmacies in Venezuela. So if you go to that website, you can access the documentary that I helped make last year, and also see information about the fundraiser mechanism that we've set up to channel money to community-run pharmacies in Venezuela. So I know I went a little bit over time. I will stop there and allow for questions and comments.
Okay, so we have several questions in the Q&A. What international laws make the sanctions illegal? Asked Paul Shannon.
Yes, so there are a number of things. So the Fourth Geneva Convention, 1949, is an important one. Article 33 prohibits collective punishment. So if we consider the sanctions a form of collective punishment, and we can basically just look to the statements of U.S. officials themselves to corroborate that, that's a violation of the Geneva Convention, to which the United States is a party. If we look at U.S. law, the U.S. Code of Federal Regulations defines international terrorism as a policy that uses the threat or act of violence to coerce a civilian population and to thereby influence a government. So that's the US's own definition of international terrorism. So, I mean, there are other legal statutes that we could talk about as well, but those are two examples.
Okay, great. What is the legal status of Citgo? Asked Timothea Papas.
Yeah, so Citgo, US-based, oil assets that I think they're worth somewhere in the range of $5 billion or something. Since January of last year, the Maduro administration has been unable to access those assets. And this is actually a bigger phenomenon. There's assets that the Venezuelan government has all over the world that have essentially been frozen because the United States and about 60 other countries allied with the United States have recognized Guaido as the president. So that froze the assets that are held in foreign banks and has prevented the Maduro administration from accessing all of these billions and billions of dollars in foreign funds. So Citgo is one example of that. And to this, as of now, the Maduro administration still hasn't been able to get access to any of the Citgo funds. They're legally, as far as I understand, have been transferred to Guaido, but Guaido doesn't really wield any formal power in Venezuela, despite the fact that he anointed himself as interim president.
Okay, great. Trump says he's sending warships to Venezuela now. What might that mean for us, says Alan Math.
Well, I'm taking it that's the announcement from yesterday. I probably don't know much more about it than any of you, since it's so recent. My understanding is that he's effectively doubled the naval presence in the Caribbean, which is clearly a threat to Venezuela. It's meant to send a real message to Venezuela. So, I don't have too much more to say. I think that it's, the prospect of a direct U.S. military intervention would incur a lot of resistance from within certain elite segments in the United States. I'm not sure that the Pentagon is ready and willing to go that route. But we can't rule it out, right? With Trump, you can't rule something like that out.
Okay, thank you. Mary Ellen Kirkles asks, how much of this economic warfare do you think is the influence of Pompeo and other neocons who influenced this administration? Beyond that, how much would you imagine that a 2021 Democratic administration would relieve the pressure on Venezuela and other countries?
Yeah, I think that there is a difference between Democrats and Republicans on this, but it's a difference of degree. Because remember, Obama initiated the first real sanctions against Venezuela in that absurd March 2015 declaration. But Trump significantly escalated the sanctions, and the sanctions under Trump have taken a much broader, more encompassing form. Directly targeting the Venezuelan financial sector and the Venezuelan oil company. So there is certainly a difference of degree between the two parties. Now, that being said, it's difficult to imagine what a President Biden, if it comes to that, would do with the sanctions. It's plausible to imagine some loosening of the sanctions, back to Obama era levels. But on the other hand, most of the Democratic primary candidates for president in this ongoing election season have expressed support for the sanctions. So even Elizabeth Warren, up until a few months ago was basically saying vocally, I support the sanctions. And even in the last several months, we locally here have been organizing to try to get her to come out and condemn the sanctions. She's sort of done it privately, but has to this point refused to come out publicly in condemnation of these sanctions. So I'm not sure what to expect from a potential Democratic administration. Bernie Sanders has been virtually alone among the presidential candidates in condemning the sanctions. So I think that this is the sanctions and economic warfare is a bipartisan policy, but there is a difference of degree between the two parties.
Okay, John Ratliff asks, how has Venezuela utilized its food programs, CLAP, C-L-A-P-P, and communes to mitigate the impact of sanctions and to maintain the ability of the poorest section of the population to resist U.S. diktats?
Yeah, so the so-called CLAP program, the Local Committees for Supply and Production, is a food distribution program. It reaches, I think, about 7 million Venezuelans each month. So it distributes certain staple foods in the form of packages that are taken around the country. And it's an important source of nutrition for millions of Venezuelans. There's no doubt about that. And it's a program that the government is running. In conjunction with that, there are other programs that pair farmers in the countryside with urban neighborhoods. There's something called the Plan Pueblo a Pueblo that links people in the countryside with people in the cities. The vast majority of Venezuelans live in the cities. And this is one of the historic structural weaknesses of the Venezuelan economy that is so dependent on food imports, and its agricultural sector is relatively weak. Has a lot of land, but agriculture is still underdeveloped. They still are quite dependent on food imports. So there has been some effort to address that, though, and there have been, these efforts to tie farmers with communities in the cities who need the food. So certainly those efforts have mitigated the crisis, but the crisis is still very severe, and it's getting more severe due to the factors that I've talked about.
Okay, Prasanna Parthasarathi asks, how do we balance the need to reduce fossil fuel consumption with the needs of the Venezuelan economy, which is so dependent on oil?
Yeah, it's a great question. And, I think one of the lessons of the Venezuelan experience in the last few years is that the transition away from oil, it can't be done in a sudden overnight kind of way. It needs to be a carefully planned transition that pays particular attention to economies like Venezuela's that are so overwhelmingly dependent on the export of fossil fuels. So, obviously from a scientific and ecological perspective, there's no other choice. We have to taper back and eliminate the use of fossil fuels. But what happens when you do that drastically without putting in place the other pillars of support to make up for that lost revenue? In the case of an economy like Venezuela, you see something like the graph that I showed earlier, where oil production plummets, national revenue plummets, and they don't have money to import the things that they need. So I think that speaks to the need for a carefully managed, just transition. That's one of the terms that's often used in ecological circles for the need to take full account of the social and economic implications of the transition away from fossil fuels. That means providing aid and retraining for workers in the fossil fuels industries, providing alternative development assistance for countries like Venezuela, and a whole host of other things. So I think it speaks to the need for a carefully planned transition rather than a sudden overnight kind of shock.
Great. Okay, thank you. And Ellen Mass asks, Ed Markey did not answer the question related to Venezuela when asked about sanctions today. What would you say is needed to develop more senatorial support? I'm not sure when Markey was asked that question, but looks like Ellen has information on that.
Yeah, I mean, I know that of the recent congressional efforts I know that Senator Chris Murphy has a letter calling for an end to sanctions against Iran and Venezuela. And neither Markey nor Warren has signed on. That's my impression as of yesterday. So, as to what we do to pressure these senators, it's a tough call. I think that we have to, to some extent, just keep hammering away and try to figure out, how to escalate our method of attack in these moments. I think that there is, in the current moment, there is some opening for us because the sanctions have received more and more international outcry over the last several weeks, especially in the case of Iran, Venezuela, and Cuba. The EU has come out, close ally of the United States has come out and condemned the sanctions against Venezuela. They've also said that they're going to disobey the sanctions against Iran, at least in a limited way. So, there is a context which I think is more supportive of our demands, and we could to leverage the crisis, if we're going to use the terms that the Trump administration is using. We can. The moment is a little bit more favorable for us for pressing this message, because the need for doing away with the sanctions is so obvious to anyone who looks at the situation.
Great. More questions keep coming in as fast as you can answer them, Kevin. So we'll keep going a little bit longer if you can stay.
Sure.
John Ratliff asked, do the resources in gold and coltran, if developed, offer a possible road to promote the transition and to have immediate relief from the sanctions?
Yeah, I guess I don't know enough about those sectors to comment with much confidence. Any alternative form of mining is still going to carry some significant downsides, environmentally speaking, for instance. But I guess I don't know quite enough to speak with confidence about the immediate prospects for those sectors.
Okay, and this last one could possibly be a good wrap-up question. How do you explain the amazing ability of the Bolivarian Revolution to survive the boot of the U.S. empire on its neck for so many years, and especially in the last 3 years? Asked Yoav Elenevsky.
Yeah, it's a good question, and I don't really have an answer. It is the sort of organization that is necessary to endure this kind of pain and suffering has been in the works for a long time. So Chavez's efforts to promote grassroots organization throughout the country, I think that those networks and those councils and those commune structures, they're still around today, and they're still leading the organizational response and the sort of mutual aid response that we're seeing in this country today in the midst of this pandemic. Those kinds of networks have been around in Venezuela for a long time now, and they have, at least generally speaking, they have significant support from the level of the national government, which obviously we don't have in this country, and never really have. So the combination of government safety net measures and civil society's own organizational structures, I think, is a big piece of the reason why. But there is significant discontent with the Venezuelan government. We can't deny that. But at the same time, I think people recognize that U.S. sanctions are designed to harm civilians for political purposes. And that's why something like 2/3 of the Venezuelan population condemns the sanctions. So I think that, I don't have a clear answer as to why people have been able to endure and make it through that. I think that, people often surprise us with just how resilient and resourceful they are under conditions of extreme stress. But, they can't endure forever. So the situation is at the current moment probably more dire economically and from a public health standpoint than it has been any time in recent memory.
Great, thanks. So maybe, Brian, we go back to you for wrap-up remarks.
Sure. I just want to thank Professor Young for joining us tonight and for that really comprehensive presentation. I feel a lot more educated on the subject now because of it. So thank you so much, and thank you to the audience for joining us tonight and educating yourselves on this important issue. Just to reiterate some of the action items that Professor Young talked about. First, I want to encourage people to visit VenezuelansUnderSiege.com. There you can access the documentary that Professor Young worked on, and there's also an opportunity to donate to benefit the Venezuelan people that are struggling so much under harsh economic sanctions. But I believe we have the ability to send a follow-up email to all of our participants, and we will send that out. Have all relevant links, so you can send a message to Congress, and put some pressure on them, as well as sign up for our upcoming webinars next week. Next week on the 9th at 7 p.m., we're going to be talking about the effects of sanctions on Cuba and their efforts to fight the coronavirus. And the following week at 8 p.m., we will be talking about the effects of sanctions on North Korea and how South Korea managed to fight the coronavirus so well, and what we can learn from them. But until then, we need to keep an eye on this space with tensions ratcheting up with Venezuela, with warships on the way, with a bounty out on a foreign leader. We need to keep our eye on Venezuela and Latin America. And get on the phone if you can, call Congress and tell them if they're really serious about resisting Trump, they should open their mouths and say something about this. Tell them to support Ilhan Omar's bill. Tell them to support David Cicilline's bill. Tell them if they're serious about resisting Trump, they should resist this march to war. We really need you. So with that, I want to thank everyone and wish everyone well. You and your families, stay home and stay safe. Thank you so much for joining us. We appreciate it.
Thank you.